Welcome back once again to the Asheville Vedic Astrology YouTube channel, youtube.com/Ryan's Vedic Astrology. Once again, we have a presentation by the one and only Fernando, who is at this time, as of this recording, completing the 4-year Asheville Vedic Astrology Apprenticeship Program. And as you know, in that program, people who finally make it to the end, if they make it to the end, if they don't get bored or burn out, they're required to write 3 10,000-word papers, to record 3 separate informational videos for this channel of high quality, as well as to do a number of sessions on a donation basis to get the stamp of approval from Asheville Vedic Astrology. And Fernando, like Fiona and many others, are some of the top students. Fernando will be speaking to us today. It's hard to say what the best way to pigeonhole this. He'll be talking about the differences between Jyotish Vedic astrology and maybe traditional Western astrology. To me, it seemed more like a conversation between the differences of Western and Eastern astrology, or even modern ancient astrology, because ultimately, in my mind, there really is only one astrology, and all of the different branches or cultures that hold bits and pieces and fragments of astrology, they're all just holding bits, pieces, and fragments of the whole. So really, he seems to be talking about differences through time and differences through culture. I thought it'd be wonderful to entitle the video The 12 Things That You Got Wrong About Astrology, because he goes over 12 very important topics related to dashas and timing, how we perceive the nodes of the moon, differences in how astrologers and how the ideas of the 4th and 10th house have changed through time. Just wonderful what Fernando has done. He is a veritable encyclopedia of information, and along with that, a very kind, compassionate, caring, and intelligent and thoughtful astrologer. So enjoy this video. Don't hesitate to put your comments down in the chat box, and I hope you enjoy it.
Hello. My name is Fernando Raúl Castro Alvarez, and I am part of the 4-year Asheville Vedic Astrology Apprenticeship course. And today I'm making this video as part of my final project for this year. And this is going to be an interesting video. What we're going to do in this video is that we're going to be discussing 12 big differences between Jyotisha, which is the Vedic astrology of India, and traditional non-Jyotish astrology. Now, it is very important to identify the correct astrological terminology when we're doing astrology, because today, even though astrology is all over the place in the internet, I've come to the conclusion that people don't really know how to differentiate different types of astrology. They don't know how to differentiate different perspectives in terms of what a sort of astrology postulates and what other postulates, which sometimes can be completely different, right? So first of all, let's describe what traditional astrology is in terms of what modern astrology is. To be brief and fast, traditional astrology alludes to the astrology that was practiced before the 18th 19th century, more or less. I would say the 18th century more than anything else. It's the astrology that was practiced from the 18th century going back. And, you know, there are different perspectives in terms of how we can frame the history of astrology, but academia would say that astrology more or less began, as we know it as horoscopic astrology, more or less began in the 1st century BC, with the inception of the Macedonian Hellenistic Empire, where astrologies of Mesopotamia and Egypt fused together within the multicultural Hellenistic context of the Mediterranean. Now, before the 2nd century BC, astrology existed in Mesopotamia and in Egypt, but it wasn't horoscopic astrology. It wasn't the astrology based on houses, signs, planets, aspects, and most importantly, an ascendant. It was the not the offshoot, the forerunner of what horoscopic astrology would become in the 2nd century BC onwards. Now, the earliest that I've seen where we have like bits and pieces of what astrology could be dates back to the 7th century BC in Mesopotamia. But obviously, we have huge structures all over the world throughout different civilizations where stargazing, solar gazing was present. Now, that is the academic context. From the Jyotisha point of view, astrology is much, much older, right? But that is a perspective based on faith and based on religious precepts. From the Jyotisha perspective, some people say that astrology is well over, well over 3,000 years old. Some people say even more. Some people say 10,000. Some people say 16,000. But, that is something that academia cannot verify, and to a certain degree cannot ratify, because modern academia is based on evidence. And the earliest references of astrology that academia holds are the ones in Mesopotamia, because there are tablets, physical evidence that backs up that claim, right? So basically, that is traditional astrology. From a chronological point of view, it is the astrology that was practiced before the 18th century, 1700s. Okay. Now, traditional astrology was mainly a religious, spiritually well-structured discipline that dealt with the destiny of men, of places, of whatever, based on the astrological positions. Destiny was something that was very clear, that was something very strong, and there were clear demarcations between what was difficult and what was easy, or what was hard and what was soft or gentle. There were clear demarcations about what was good, what was bad. Okay, so I am summarizing this very fast in order to proceed with the presentation. Now, what is the antithesis, or let's say the contrary to traditional astrology would be modern astrology, which is the astrology that is practiced, chronologically speaking, from the 18th, 19th century onwards. Now, during this period, traditional astrology is present, but it is present in bits and fragments until very recently, like a few decades ago. But the idea is that from the 17th, 18th century onward, modern astrology takes hold. And this is a more secularized astrology, an astrology that is interpreted from the modern perspective of evolution, of progress, of the idea of becoming, of not being, which would be more of a traditional astrology. Modern astrology relies a lot on psychological interpretations. Modern astrology relies a lot upon secular postulates that don't necessarily allude to a larger theological body of work, be it religious or be it, an initiatory school or that sort of thing that was very traditional to traditional astrology. And to a certain degree, it is an astrology that is constantly changing, it is constantly evolving, it is constantly progressing. And at the same time, it has a lot of ideas and structures that are purely modern. That stem principally from a theosophical background and a modern psychological one. So you see, those are the difference between modern and traditional astrology. So what we're going to do in this video is that we're going to analyze the differences, big difference, 12 big differences that exist between traditional Jyotish, and remember, there is modern astrology that is Vedic astrology, and I would say a lot of it. But this is like traditional Jyotish, and when we're saying traditional Jyotish, we are strictly talking about Brihat Parashara Hora Shastra, and we're talking about the 5 big books: Brihat Jataka, Saravali, Sarvana Shintamani, Faladipika, and Jataka Pariyata. And always, you can add also Jaimini Sutras to a certain degree, and, other books like Prashna Marga, Prashna Tantra, and so on and so forth. And that's traditional Jyotish. We're not talking about modern Jyotish where, the nodes represent reincarnation and past lives. We're not talking about, modern Jyotish where you include the Trans-Saturnians. No, we're talking about traditional Jyotish. And what we're going to do is we're going to compare that traditional Jyotish to non-Jyotish traditional astrology. And by non-Jyotish traditional astrology, we're specifically referring to 4 types of astrology here. Hellenistic astrology, which was the astrology practice in the Mediterranean and near parts until I would say the 5th, 7th century AD. Then we're going to talk about like Muslim astrology, which was the offshoot of Hellenistic astrology, and parallel medieval astrology and Renaissance astrology until the development of traditional astrology, let's say, it ends in the 18th century due to the scientific revolutions and the whole Enlightenment and the idea that, humanism, secular society are taking hold of the more traditional norms in European societies. Now, these are non-Jyotish traditional astrology. So what we're going to do is we're going to see 12 big differences between Jyotish, traditional Jyotish, and non-Jyotish traditional astrology. Now, I chose 12 differences, but I have to allude to the fact that there are many more differences, smaller in scale. But what I've done in this presentation is that I picked 12 big differences, because these are 12 big differences that I, stumble upon as I did my learning and studies. And it's something that a lot of people don't talk about, because let's be honest, right now, there are a lot of bridges to be built between traditional Jyotish and Hellenistic, Muslim, medieval, and Renaissance traditional astrology. Because it is my opinion that a lot of techniques within Jyotish are really Hellenistic and Arab, and they survived in India and they did not survive in the Mediterranean. And now we're rediscovering them. And me, as a person who first learned Jyotish and now is getting into Hellenistic and Muslim astrology, you see a lot of parallels. And you realize, wow, this survived in India. It did not survive in other places. And we're just building bridges, okay? So you have to take that into consideration, because I think this presentation will help a lot to understand what traditional astrology is. Because in the end, there's only one traditional astrology. There are different schools, there are different perspectives within the traditional perspective. But the idea is that, there's only one sun, there's only one Saturn, there's only one moon. So there can be certain bridges that can build, a traditional corpus of astrological knowledge. Okay, so what we're going to do here is that we're going to talk about those 12 differences that to some might be impressive, and some might know it already, but it's going to be a cool video because I think it's going to be a great tool for educational purposes for people who are getting their feet wet and starting to see like parallels, differences between traditional Jyotish and non-Jyotish traditional astrology. So let's go to the graphics and start this little presentation. So I have here my PowerPoint. Man, I'm gonna apologize. I cannot put my PowerPoint on presentation B because I don't know. I have a 10-year-old MacBook. The thing is that I put a monitor once, a projector, I'm sorry, and it got all screwed up. But you can see the presentation here, and basically 12 differences between traditional Jyotish and traditional non-Jyotish astrology by Fernando Raúl Castro Álvarez. And, let's start with the first one. And this is the big elephant on the room. So, let me go here. And this is the big elephant in the room. This is like the easiest difference that people will point out. Now, there's a lot to this. So let's start talking about this. As some of you might know, the majority of people who do Jyotisha today use a sidereal zodiac, while the majority of non-Jyotish traditional astrologies use a tropical zodiac. Before we continue, it is very important to point out something that is seldom spoken by astrologers and astronomers at the same time. Astrologers need to learn astronomy. Astronomers need to humble up and learn some astrology. But the idea here is that there are 3 zodiacs. There is the astronomical zodiac, there is the sidereal zodiac, and there is the tropical zodiac. You can only do astrology with the sidereal and the tropical. You cannot do astrology with the astronomical zodiac. What are the differences? The astronomical zodiac is in a category by its own. The astronomical zodiac is based on the 13, although those constellations are extremely subjective, but the idea is that the astronomical zodiac is based on 13 solid, concrete constellations that go throughout the ecliptic, which is the apparent path of the sun in relation to the Earth. Okay? The astronomical zodiac is based on stars. They're based on stars that do move, and stars move a lot faster than people think. They can move significantly in 100 years. Stars basically form the astronomical zodiac, real concrete astrophenomena. But you do not do astrology with the astronomical zodiac, because these areas within the astronomical zodiac are asymmetrical. And for astrology, you need symmetrical areas. So you cannot do astrology with the constellations. That is a postulate that is very clear and very simple to understand. Now, you do astrology with the sidereal zodiac and the tropical zodiac, right? And these are more or less the same. The only difference is the way you start counting it, because both the sidereal and tropical zodiac is based on 12 imaginary symmetrical areas of 13 degrees all throughout the ecliptic, which from an astronomical point of view are constructed both from synodical lunar months and the path of the sun through the ecliptic in a 365 year day period, which is the time that the Earth rotates around the sun. So that combination creates the 12 areas and the 12 months based on the synodical lunar months. Okay, so basically you have that idea of the 12 solar mansions, which is the rashis to a certain degree. Now, the difference is that the sidereal zodiac starts to count from a certain point in the sidereal sky. Okay? That is the big difference. Okay? You start counting the 12 areas from a specific point, specifically from a star, and that point is called the Ayanamsha, which corrects the difference between the tropical and the sidereal zodiac. Now, a lot of people don't know this. A lot of astrologers do not explain this, but there is no such thing as a correct Ayanamsha. There is no such thing as a best Ayanamsha. There is no such thing as the Ayanamsha that Parashara talks about. There is no such thing as the Ayanamsha that, well, I don't know about Varahamihira. I don't think he talks about it specifically in the Panchasiddhantika. But the idea is that in astrological books like the Brihajataka and Brihatarashara Horashastra, you will never see a reference to, and remember, use this Ayanamsha. The Ayanamsha is a correction that is done from the tropical zodiac. And the majority of the Ayanamshas in Jyotish either come from Chitra or Meena, which Chitra would be Spica, and Meena would be Cetapicium, if I'm not mistaken, which is a star in the constellation of Pisces. So basically, you pick a point and you start counting the 12 symmetrical 30 degrees areas from that point, and there you have a sidereal zodiac. And remember, the sidereal zodiac does not have to do with the stars, even though it's a sidereal. It has to do with the idea that it's counted from a star. Because as I mentioned, to do astrology, the stars have nothing to do with it. It has to do with the imaginary areas. Now, the sidereal zodiac is constructed from a star, while the tropical zodiac is constructed from the 0 point Aries, which is the point of the vernal equinox in the northern hemisphere that changes in relation to the astronomical or sidereal backdrop 1 degree every 72 years, more or less. And basically, that's the difference in terms of the three zodiacs. The idea here is that in Jyotish, today, the majority of people use the sidereal zodiac with the Chitrapaksha Ayanamsha, which is the Lahiri Ayanamsha, which is an Ayanamsha that was popularized after the independence of India and was mainly put in place to homogenize a lot of Indian panchangas and to homogenize the modern state of India. it was not selected through a thorough astrological congress, as I did believe a few years ago in my immaturity in my studies. So this was a purely bureaucratic decision to use Lahiri Ayanamsha, but today the majority of astrologers use it, to such a degree that some people say that the Ayanamsha issue is settled because Lahiri is the real Ayanamsha. But that's not necessarily true, because we have a lot of Ayanamshas. But what is clear is that the majority of people in Jyotish do Jyotish with a sidereal zodiac. However, there are people who do Jyotish with a tropical zodiac, like myself. Now, it is a misunderstanding to say that people like myself use a tropical zodiac, because yes, we use a tropical zodiac for the rashis, but we use sidereal nakshatras, which allow us to do a lot of the natural Vedic techniques. So it's basically like two zodiacs at the same time, if you really think about it. Now, this is important to notice, because you will see that in Jyotish, there is such a thing as tropical Jyotish, right? It's something I do. It's something that a lot of people in this channel do, and in others also. And it is my opinion that during this century, this idea of doing Jyotish with a tropical zodiac will become more and more common, because the idea of a sidereal zodiac is, in my opinion, something that does not follow the tradition. Because if you look back at ancient civilizations, you will see that the majority of the temples, the majority of these structures were oriented towards the sun. There was a sun worship. There was no such thing as a constellation worship. There was a worship of certain stars. There was a worship, especially, for example, Sirius in Egypt with the flooding of the Nile and so on. But the idea is that going back, the sun was the main symbol in terms of spirituality, religiosity, and timekeeping. And as time went by, the idea of the stars became more popularized. But then people realized, no, it's the sun, the most important thing. So it is my opinion, and this is my opinion, I am not an academic, this is my hypothesis, that the idea of using the stars as references for the path of the sun was something that was developed later on. And sidereal zodiac is used in Babylonian astrology, in Jyotish, and in something called Western sidereal astrology. But the majority of astrologers in the traditional world used a tropical zodiac. There is debate about if the Greeks used a sidereal or a tropical zodiac, but the idea is that since the discovery, or I sometimes like to say rediscovery, but I'm getting conspiracy theory here. But the idea of the discovery of the precession of the equinoxes by Hipparchus of Nicaea in the 2nd century BC, kind of gave the idea of the tropical zodiac more validity, but it didn't catch up until 400 years later in the 2nd century AD. Now, Hellenistics use tropical zodiac. Most Arabs use it, although some people say that they use a sidereal zodiac. And obviously, medieval and Renaissance astrologers in Europe used it. So this is a big difference. And this is the most common difference that most people who are aware of astrology and their most basic concepts are aware of. But be aware that while Jyotish is primarily done sidereally, people do use tropical zodiac with sidereal nakshatras to do Vedic astrology, and that's probably something that is going to catch up more and more in this century, is my opinion. Probably in 100 years is going to be more generalized, while in non-Jyotish traditional astrologies like Hellenistic, Arab, Arab Muslim, and medieval and Renaissance astrology used the tropical zodiac. There is no such thing as astrology that is based purely on the stars and the astronomical zodiac. That is something that is more prevalent in modern astrology, where they invent a new sort of astrology every day, right? Because you remember, you have to use astrology with symmetrical areas of 30 degrees each, and they are imaginary. So if you hear an astrologer, a sidereal astrologer, say that I use the sidereal zodiac because it closely resembles the constellation more than the tropical zodiac, it does not make sense, because the rashis are constructed from the sun. They are constructed from the movement of the sun in relation to the earth. All the categories of the rashis are based on tropical motions, although some people say that's not true, and try to look for, as we say in my country, the 5 legs to the cat. The reality is that the idea of, for example, the quadruplicities are, or the modalities are something that has to do with the change of seasons. The idea of the triplicities is something else. It's not necessarily something related to the zodiac per se, but the idea of the quadruplicities is, and at the same time, it makes sense with the idea of the changing of the stations, but more than anything else in terms of the stations of winter, spring, summer, and autumn, it's the idea of the ecliptic and how the Tropic of Cancer relates to some specific stuff. The Tropic of Capricorn relates to other stuff. And obviously the equinox points in Libra and Aries. So this is a big difference. And, you know, I spent a little time here to explain certain things, but you have to take that into consideration. Jyotish is done sidereally, as some might know. There is use of tropical zodiac with sidereal nakshatras, while non-Jyotish traditional astrologies mainly use a tropical zodiac. So let's go to the other 11 differences. So now we're going to go to a big difference. This is a big difference that really struck out for me when I learned it a few years ago. This is the 4th house, 10th house parents dichotomy. And this is very interesting because you're going to see that the illusions of the houses change from astrological school to astrological school. They inevitably change with time. There are certain things that stay the same. For example, the ascendant is always the body, and that has stayed the same for hundreds of years, centuries, right? But the illusions of the houses are the areas of life. And the areas of life will change through cultures and through traditions. If you analyze the significators of the houses between Jyotish, Muslim, and Hellenistic astrology, you will see differences. And Renaissance astrology in Europe, for example, William Lilly, you will see differences. You will see noticeable differences here and there. And also you will see how they exchange significators. But I have to emphasize that one of the biggest differences that really strikes out is the parent dichotomy between Jyotish and non-Jyotish traditional astrologies. And that is that in Jyotish, the mother is the 4th house, while the father is the 10th house and sometimes the 9th. But usually the 10th house as an authority figure, the 9th house as a guru figure. That is something that most Jyotishis know. But the reality is that in non-Jyotish traditional astrology, the significators are exchanged. And the 4th house is the father, and the 10th house is the mother. Now, this really creates a conundrum, because when you come to predictions, you know, it's kind of difficult. However, you have to realize when it comes to second-person predictions on a chart, you are going to have less probabilities. You know, a chart is for the person who that chart alludes to. Predictions dealing with family members or other people seen through the natal chart are not, you know, I would say airtight predictions. For that, you should use prashnas or horaries, okay? But the idea here is that in terms of natal significators, the 4th house is the mother in Jyotish because the 4th alludes to the domestic house, the private house, where women would usually stay and put things in order, while the 10th alludes to, you know, the father, the power, the status, the public life. So that is the rationale in Jyotish. While in non-Jyotish traditional astrology, the rationale is that the father is the 4th house because the father alludes to the property, to the terrain, to the field, to the earth. How do you call that in English? To the property, right? To the terrains that one has, to property that one has, and how the patriarchal lineage would predetermine who inherited that land, who inherited that piece of land that was so important to the family. So you take that into consideration, and now you see. Now, the mother to the 10th would be the idea of putting the woman in a power position in terms of how she is, you know, the neck, and maybe the father is the head. But this is a rationale that you have to take into consideration, because this is one of the biggest differences. There's another difference that we're going to be discussing later on that has to do with the 11th house. But this is one of the biggest differences, because once again, the illusions of the houses do not change as easily through time, but they do change in terms of culture, in terms of time, in relation to the primary significators of the houses. And, for example, just take the idea of how the 10th has changed throughout time. The 10th was the house of the king, of the power, of the government. Today is the house of the profession, but it still alludes to the government, to the king, and so on and so forth. So this is one of the biggest differences that you have to take into consideration, because if you do not know this, you're going to get confused. If you started reading and learning Jyotish and then you go to William Lilly and then you say the fourth is the father, what is this? Or if you come from non-Jyotish traditional astrology and see that the fourth is the father, and then you see all these allusions to the mother, to the fourth, the idea of the fourth being the mother, the moon and Venus having Digbala in the fourth, which would be like feminine planets in that side of the angular house of the fourth, and how Mars and Sun have Digbala in the 10th, which would be a more masculine quadrant, and how that is inversed in non-Jyotish traditional astrology, then it's gonna be big, okay? And I chose this as one of the main categories because these are angular houses, these are Kendra houses, these are basically the spinal cord of the chart, the houses that will be more predisposed towards power and conscious action in life. So how do we amend this? This is how I do it. If there are things related to the 4th and the 10th, obviously, you're going to allude to all the other things that do not have to do with parents, like residence and profession, private life, public life, career, domestic life, and so on and so forth. But when it comes to parents here, you just talk about the parents. If you're not going to say the mother specifically or the father, you're going to say the parents. And if you want, you can ask the client if their dad is alive or her mother is alive. This is something I do ask in my consultations when I do them via internet. I always like to know if the father or the mother is alive or dead, in order to do rectifications and other calculations in terms of mortality, but in order to fix this dichotomy of the parents. Okay, so let's move on to point 3, which is another interesting one, which is the relationship between Sun and Saturn. This is a very interesting one. Okay, as you know, Sun and Saturn in Jyotish are really bad enemies. Okay, it's really interesting because if you see the dignity scheme, specifically the Satyasharya scheme, which we're going to talk about that in another difference, but you always see astrologers talk about, oh, Sun and Saturn are the worst enemies, but they seldom talk about the Sun and Venus because they are also worst enemies. And this is something you have to have into consideration. People talk about Sun Saturn, but Sun Venus is also one of the only 2 relationships in Jyotish where there are great enemies mutually. Okay, but people usually talk about Sun Saturn, and the mythology behind this is that, well, the Sun is the father of Saturn, but he had Saturn somehow illegitimately with a wife that was not her wife. And Sun is hot, it's light, Saturn is cold, is darkness. So you have those allusions in terms of how they relate to each other. And you also have the idea of how the luminaries are in opposition to the signs of Saturn in the chart, right? So this is something that in Jyotish is known. However, in non-Jyotish traditional astrologies, the relationship between the Sun and Saturn is not that bad. And this is something that really struck a chord with me, specifically because, number one, the Sun and Saturn belong to the same sect. And if you don't know what a sect is, we're going to talk about that later on, which is another big differences between Jyotish and non-Jyotish traditional astrologies. And at the same time, Sun and Saturn share triplicity lordships for fire or triplicities. That is, Aries, Leo, and Sagittarius. Obviously, with Jupiter, Sun being the principal ruler in day charts, Jupiter being the secondary ruler but the prime ruler in night charts and Saturn being the third one. So this is very important for timing schemes in terms of Hellenistic astrology. And obviously you have the sect. So, this idea of hot and cold in Jyotish, where you see, oh, wow, they're worst enemies, in non-Jyotish traditional astrologies is more or less amend in the idea that Saturn belongs to the day sect because during the day, the cold and dryness of Saturn becomes more, elastic, more subtle. It becomes more warm, and he can, do things. The idea of the conjunctions of Sun and Saturn are seen very badly in Jyotish. In non-Jyotish traditional astrologies, they're not seen as bad unless Saturn is combusted, right? Combustion always hurts any planet, doesn't matter where it is. But, these are things that you have to take into consideration. And obviously, the idea of the whole mythology behind the sun being the father of Saturn in Jyotish does not exist in Hellenistic or Arab or medieval Renaissance astrology. So you don't have that religious mythology, because I think this is one of the main reasons why this is. And we're going to see this when we talk about sect and we talk about Kalevala and one of the later differences, that this idea of the mythology behind Shani and Surya probably was very important to separate them in Jyotish, while in other astrologies, they didn't become real enemies as it is in Jyotish. So that is very important to know. So let's move to the fourth one, and the luminaries and their qualities. This is a very important one. In Jyotish, as you might know, the sun is a malefic, and the moon can be a benefic or a malefic depending on what station or tithi it is, right? It is very interesting to see that although the sun is a malefic, many times astrologers allude to it as a mild malefic. And at the same time, the moon is a planet that changes. So even though the sun is a malefic, he's not that of a malefic. And at the same time, even though the moon can be a malefic, she can be a benefic. And even though the moon is a benefic, she can be a malefic. And as you can see, the idea of the sun and the moon also in Jyotish, they have a very good relationship. They're both mutual best friends, okay? So they have something going on there. And they change a lot in terms, especially the moon, change a lot in terms of the dignity it might have, but depending on its tithi, okay? Now, in non-Jyotish traditional astrologies, the luminaries have a kind of neutral significators. Even though they're luminaries, they have two different teams. They belong to two different sects: the day sects or the lunar sect, and the sun sect or the solar sect. So we see here how in Jyotish, for one, the dignity kind of changes, while in non-Jyotish traditional astrologies, they kind of remain neutral. At the same time, you have a very good dignity between the sun and the moon in Jyotish, while you don't have that in Hellenistic astrology in terms of sect, right? The day sect is a team and the night sect is another team. So you see how the luminaries change their qualities in these two types of astrology. Now, in Jyotish, there's no such thing as combustion of the moon, although I've seen Jyotishis talk about that. In Hellenistic astrology, they don't, but I mean, in non-Jyotish traditional astrologies, it is not called always combustion of the moon, but when the moon is conjunct the sun, it is not that good. And also in Jyotish, it is not that good, specifically if she's moving towards, a waning moon, right? But this is something that you have to take into consideration, because it is something that you take into consideration, because also the moon and the sun within traditional non-Jyotish astrologies are very important to calculate longevity of life. While in Jyotish, you calculate longevity through a lot of things like the Lagna Lord, the Eighth Lord, the Atmakarka. You can do it with Ashtaka Varga. You can do it with other techniques. Like there's a chapter where you have like 3 techniques plus the Ashtaka Varga and Brihat Parashara Hora Shastra. So you have to take that into consideration. The sun is not seen as a malefic in non-Jyotish astrology. He's seen as a neutral. And I would, postulate that in Jyotish, he's also seen as a neutral, because sometimes he's set as a mild malefic, mainly because it has to do with, our consistency, our honor, our spirit, our essence. While the moon is not necessarily seen as a malefic or a malefic, she's seen, more as a neutral. Now, the void of course moon is something that is very bad, or not very bad, but it's bad within non-Jyotish traditional astrologies. Well, in Jyotish, the void of course moon is non-existent, but the idea of a moon that is alone, that does not a Sunafa or an Afa yoga, which has a Kemadruma yoga, then it is bad. So that would be more or less the equivalent of the void of course moon within this category of the luminaries. So have that in consideration. So let's move on to the next one, which is sect and Kalevala. We've spoken about this so far, about sect and Kalevala. Sect is something that exists in non-Jyotish traditional astrologies, but it's something that, let's say, it exists, but it's just not as important as in non-Jyotish traditional astrologies. Now, let's explain what sect is. Sect is basically dividing the chart into two groups, the day sect and the night sect. There is always one that predominates depending on the time of birth. If it's a day chart, the day sect predominates. If it's a night chart, the night sect predominates. And the night sect is the moon, Mars, and Venus. The day sect is Sun, Saturn, and Jupiter. In a day chart, Jupiter will become a better benefic, Venus will become a less effective benefic, Saturn will become a more constructive malefic, Mars will become a more disruptive malefic. In a night chart, the night sect predominates, hence, Venus will be a more efficient benefic, Jupiter will be a less efficient benefic, Mars will be a more constructive malefic, and Saturn will be a more destructive malefic. Now, you have to take into consideration other factors like dignity, aspects, and also its relation to the sun, if it's occidental or oriental. So, I'm basically describing sect. You can look up videos on YouTube on it. It's a very easy concept. And I've used it in Jyotish, and I think it's really good because the idea is that if you are a night chart, Saturn will be more disruptive. So that's going to be probably a more difficult Saturn return. Saturn will cause more problems. If you were born during the day, Mars will be a more disruptive malefic. So accidents can happen. And at the same time, they sect Jupiter, they birth, Jupiter will be a more efficient benefic than Venus, and vice versa. In night charts, Venus will be a more efficient benefic than Jupiter. So, someone could say that night charts maybe are more predisposed to having better relationships, while day charts are more predisposed to having, knowledge, wisdom, expansion within the spiritual realm of Jupiter. So, these are just hypotheses in my part, but this is something I use. Now, sect is a Hellenistic concept. It is used in Hellenistic astrology. It was used to a certain degree in Muslim astrology, and I believe it was used in medieval. And I don't think it was that much used in Renaissance, because this was something that was kind of lost until recently. So you have to have that into consideration. Now, sect, as I mentioned, exists in Jyotish, believe it or not, but it's not used. It is ascribed differently as in Hellenistic astrology, and it is, veiled within Kalevala. So you have to take into consideration the first thing, and that is that in Brihaparashara Hora Shastra, in chapter 3, Shloka 35-38, there is an allusion to sect. And you will see it. But planets change. Parashara states that the sun, which one was it? Exactly. The sun, Jupiter, and Venus will do well in the day, while in the night chart, Moon, Mars, and Saturn will do good. Now you see here, Parashara exchanges Saturn for Venus. Why is this? I think this is done because of the mythology associated to Surya and Shani. The idea that Surya and Shani are real enemies. So you cannot take this idea from the Yavanas, which are the Greeks, and pretend it will fly in Jyotish, because Saturn and Sun are enemies, are worst enemies. So you change it for Venus. Now, Venus is a worst enemy of the sun, so it doesn't make sense. But the idea is that this is here used. Now, this is not used at all in Jyotish, only in one place specifically, which is Kala Bala, which is one of the strengths related to Chat Bala, which is the sixth strength. Now, Kala Bala is the strength of time. Now, this is not popular, but in the books, they never explain specifically what this balas are for. They tell you how to calculate them. They sometimes vary from books to books, but the idea is that you really don't know what it is for. You only have a number, and if it's good, it's good. If it's bad, it's bad. But Kalabala, to a certain degree, according to Ernst Wilhelm, it's the idea of how planets affect time, how the idea of how a planet affects you will remain throughout time. And to calculate Kalabala, you use this idea of the day sect and the night sect, but it's just one of many calculations within. Now, I have to also mention that this idea of sect, just as Parashara mentions, is also alluded in Yavana Jataka, which is basically the first book of, let's say, Jataka Jyotisha, or natal horoscopic astrology of India. Now, Kalabala is explained in Brihat Parashara Horashastra, chapter 27, shlokas 8 and 9, where this is the chapter where he explains Shatbala. But the idea is here, sect kind of survives in Jyotish, but it is not as important as it is in traditional non-Jyotish astrology. So you have to take that into consideration. You see that they exchange Venus for Saturn, which is weird and affects all the scheme. I think this is why it's not used as the Greeks used it, because it's changed that. And once again, you see the idea of how Shani and Surya are planets that are divided always in Jyotish because they do not mix. So let's move to the sixth one, and these are dashas and perfections. This is a very good one. Traditional astrology, in contrast to modern astrology, distinguishes itself by being an astrology that relies a lot on prediction and not necessarily on psychological extrapolations. That is more of a modern astrology thing because, one, they did not know the traditional techniques. And number two, and this is more important, that sometimes escapes a lot of people, there were a lot of non-fortune telling laws in Europe and the States, which prohibited astrologers from doing time predictions. So they had to rely more on psychological extrapolations. But the idea is that in traditional astrologies, time periods are of vital importance. And in Jyotish, the principal timing systems are dashas, while in non-Jyotish traditional astrologies, the principal timing systems are perfections. As I have understood, perfections are the most ancient and the oldest forms of timing systems. So as a consequence, one might say that dashas are, let's say, newer, for not using the word more modern. Now, dashas is interesting because my experience is that most Jyotishis do not understand dashas. Because some Jyotishis believe that only Vimshottari applies. They only think that the 27 nakshatra scheme is the only one. They only think that nakshatras are 13 degrees, 20 minutes each. They only think that nakshatras allude to 9 planetary heralds, and that is incorrect. And worst of all, some people describe nakshatras using the Vimshottari time system scale of the planetary heralds related to the nakshatras. That's even worse. And by that I mean, describing Ashwini with Ketu qualities, describing Bharani with Venus qualities, and so on and so forth. That is completely incorrect. Because if you go to chapter 46 of volume 2 of Brihat Parashara Horashastra, you will see that Parashara gives 10 timing systems. Now, before we go that, we have to allude that dashas are based on the position of the moon by the Janma Nakshatra, or the Nakshatra of birth, which is the natal nakshatra of the moon, while perfections are mainly based on signs and how they relate to the Lagna. Okay, and we're going to talk about that. But let's go back to the idea that in Brihat Parashara Horashastra, in volume 2, chapter 46, Parashara gives 10 timing systems based on the moon. One of them being Vimshottari, which is a timing system of 120 years, 108 padas, 9 planetary heralds, and 27 nakshatras. But he also gives 9 other systems that Some have 27 nakshatras, so they have 28 where you have Avicii. Some have 9 planetary heralds, some have 8 planetary heralds, dropping either the North Node, the South Node, or Venus. And others have 7 planetary heralds, dropping altogether the nodes. And in all of those timing systems, the relationship between the planets and the nakshatra changes. That is why it is incorrect to say that a planet rules over a nakshatra, because the reality is that it does not rule over the nakshatra in other timing schemes. So the correct term, which is a term I'm trying to popularize, which is a term that my colleague Michael Reed coined, which is the idea of heralds. For example, Ketu is the herald of Ashwini within the Vimshottari time system. But Ashwini will have other planetary herald within the other timing systems. And this is something you have to take into consideration, because if you want to describe the nakshatras, you cannot use the planetary heralds to describe the nakshatras. You describe the nakshatras either by the deity and or the symbol, and to a certain degree the yogataras, and to a tertiary degree all the qualities that the nakshatras are given in muhurta books. But do not describe nakshatras by the herald, and do not describe nakshatras by the sign they're in, because that is incorrect also. Okay? Now, there are some serendipitous coincidences where, the herald within the Vimshottari time system will have allusions to it. For example, you can think about, Barony and Venus, the reproductive organs of a woman. You can think about the moon and Rohini, and so on and so forth. Okay? But you see here, dashas are based on the position of the moon, because the Janma nakshatra is the most important nakshatra, because it will allude to the timing system and when they start and when they end. So whenever someone asks you what is the most important nakshatra, you will say the nakshatra of the moon. Now remember, Parashara gives 10 planetary systems based on the position of the moon, but only Vimshottari applies for all charts. Why is this so? Nobody knows. Where do the timing schemes of the dashas come from? The idea of the years, for example, why Rahu is 18 years, why Jupiter is 16 years, nobody knows, okay? The dasha system within Jyotish is very complicated, because nobody knows where it comes from. Nobody knows the idea of the length of years. There's probably an explanation, but I don't think anybody knows it. And if somebody knows it, it's like hidden in some oral parampara that probably will disappear in modern times if it's not written down. So if you're seeing this video, write it down, please. Or, or the idea of why Vimshottari is the principal timing system and not Ashtotari. And I think I've heard this in one of Saptarishi's video of someone saying this. I don't remember who. But the idea that there was a debate a few centuries ago about what was the principal timing system, if it was going to be Ashtotari or Vimshottari. And I believe attention to Ashtotari or Vimshottari was very acute because they both have the number 108 in it. Ashtotari has 108 years. Vimshottari has 108 padas, which goes really nicely with the 108 number in Sanatana Dharma lore or religious custom. So, that is the dasha system. It is complicated. It's not complicated to calculate, but it is complicated to understand where it comes from. It is complicated to understand why Vimshottari is the only one. And at the same time, how Vimshottari has monopolized astrology, making people think that there are only 27 nakshatras, making people think that the nakshatras relate to the heralds of Vimshottari, and so on and so forth. So, you have to take that into consideration, because after Parashara talks about the dashas, he talks about sign timing systems, which relate to perfection. Perfections is the most simplest thing ever. You just have a horoscope where you have whole sign house system, okay? And basically, from 0 to 1 year is the first house. So from 1 to 2 is the second. So basically, it's 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 12 the first, then 24 the first, 36 the first, 12, 48 the first, and 60 the first. And each year is a house. And each year, those topics of that house, they're going to become predominant. And then you can combine that with solar returns, and then you have a great astrology. So in my opinion, perfections are much easier to use. Dashas allude to a bigger timing space. And at the same time, there are different ways to calculate dashas. Perfections are very simple. And, as Ernst Wilhelm said once, when you predict year by year and use Barsafala, use solar returns. I would recommend the more Muslim approach, not necessarily the Indian approach. It's simpler, it's more original in terms of where it came from. So that is something that you have to take into consideration. Now, perfections exist within Jyotish, not necessarily related to Varsafala. Paipatpati, I think it was the system. I don't remember, but the idea of perfections do exist, but they have certain rules within Jyotish. So have that into consideration. Now, this is very interesting. Dashas do not exist outside of Jyotish. They only exist in Jyotisha. And unfortunately, this is something I've kind of noticed. A lot of people who come into Jyotish are just amazed about Dashas because it is the first time they come into contact with timing tools, which do not exist in modern astrology. But timing tools do exist in traditional non-Jyotish astrology. And to my experience and my opinion, are simpler and easier to understand. Okay? So let's move on to the next one. We have the 11th house. This is a very interesting one. First of all, let's start. The 11th house is not a malefic house. I repeat, the 11th house is not a malefic house. The 11th house is not a malefic house. And that goes for Jyotishis, so people who practice astrology. Okay? Now, the 11th house does cause problems because it is a Trishadaya house, which is, and by the way, Trishadaya means 3, 6, 11. 3, Shat, 6, Daya, 11. That's what it means. So there's no illusion in terms of bad houses. Now, which are the bad houses? The Dushtana, 6, 8, and 12. But we're not going to talk about that. Okay? There's a lot of confusion because the 11th Lord is a functional malefic. And that term is horrible. Whoever translated that gets an F. That confuses a lot of people. It confused me. It confused a lot of students. Functional malefics are not malefic. They're functional, but they're not malefic. Functional malefics are basically planets that obstruct Raya Yogas, while functional benefics are planets that facilitate Raya Yogas. The 11th and the 3rd are obstructors of Raya Yogas, and Raya Yogas are the fusion of conscious action in relation to our dharmic spiritual fortune and how that creates great things in our lives. But if the 11th or the 3rd or the 6th, which is Adushtana, gets related to them, then that Raya Yoga ceases to be. So the 11th and the 3rd are not bad houses. They obstruct Raya Yogas. Hence, from a spiritual perspective, they can be malefic. But they are not malefic in the sense the 6th, the 12th, and the 8th are. They are obstructors. So we have to take that out of the way because it's something that is not explained, that is something that confuses students a lot, and it confused me. The 11th is not a bad house, but it does obstruct Raya Yogas, just like the 3rd. The bad house are the Dushtanas, the 11th, the 12th, and the 8th. And they're not necessarily always bad, okay? Because they will, especially the 12th and the 8th, can improve Raya Yogas to a lot if they are well dignified and they don't have any Trishadayas associated to them. So you have to take that into consideration, okay? But now that that's been said, there's a big difference between the 11th and the 12th. Mainly because, unfortunately and ignorantly, a lot of people think the 11th is a bad house. And it is not a bad house. It is a bad house from the dharmic perspective. It is. Yes, it is. It will create karma. It will create karma. But the free will triumph. And remember, the 3rd and the 11th are free will houses. They also, pertain to the Kama Trikona, which has to do with pleasure through the 5 senses and the mind. And at the same time, the 11th and the 3rd are Upashayas. They grow with time. They're houses of the free will. They will cause situations with, dharmic stuff, with religious stuff, but they're not bad. But a lot of people think in Jyotish that the 11th is a bad house. And it has like a bad rap. And that is something that you have to say because it is not bad. People think it's bad. And because people think it's bad, then the 11th is bad. But in non-Jyotish traditional astrologies, the 11th is a great place. And it's called the Agata Daimon, okay? Which is the place of the good daimon or the good spirit. The 11th was recognized from Hellenistic times as a very good house. And it is the place where Jupiter gets its joy. right? And this, to a certain degree, remains in Jyotish because the 11th, the Baba Karka for the 11th is Jupiter. So you see there a little confluence. But the idea here is that the 11th was seen as a positive house, while the 12th, Kakos diamond is, I don't like to say good or bad, but the idea is that, Saturn was related to the 12th, so it was a malefic planet, and Jupiter was related to the 11th, which was a benefic planet. So you have to take that into consideration because it is something that is there. And in Muslim astrology, the 11th was seen as a really good house in relation to the ascendant and the 10th. But in Jyotish, the 11th has fell from grace. It does not have that great status that it has in non-traditional astrologies, mainly because of the confusion of the Raya Yoga constructions. The 11th and the 3rd are not bad. They obstruct Raya Yogas. Now, if you have a Raya Yoga and the Lord of the 11th of the 3rd are there, specifically the 11th, which is the strongest Rishadaya, that's why it has that connotation negatively, it will obstruct, but it will not cause harm or hardships. It might cause it from a dharmic spiritual point of view, but you have to take that into consideration, okay? Now, the next one. This is an interesting one, dealing with essential dignity. The absence of exile or detriment, triplicity, lords, and terms in Jyotish. Now, there are two types of dignity. Remember this: accidental and essential dignity. Essential dignity has to do with where the planet is in the zodiac, in terms of zodiacal longitude, to a certain degree, zodiacal latitude. Although that will be accidental, I'm not sure. But the idea is that accidental dignity has to do with the movement of the planet, conjunctions, aspects, and all that. And we're going to talk about it later on, okay? Now, we have to remember that, and this is controversial, what I'm going to say, but in my opinion, the dignity scheme in Jyotish is a combination of the Hellenistic scheme with the Satyasharya scheme. You have to remember that in Yavana Yataka, you do not have the Satyasharya scheme that everybody's related to. The idea of the chart with the planets, friends, neutrals, and enemies. That's the Satyasharya scheme. But in Yavana Yataka, you don't have that scheme. You have a really weird scheme that is not repeated later on in the tradition. Remember, Yavana Yataka is the first Jataka Jyotisha book, or the first horoscopic astrology book. Now, the Satyasharya scheme is a mixture of Indian precepts with the Hellenistic concepts. But some Hellenistic concepts do not come through. For example, in Jyotish, there's no such thing as exile or detriment. That is the idea of the sign opposing to the domicile. It does not exist, but always the planets that are 180 degrees away from their domicile are not in the best dignity. For example, the sun in Aquarius and the sun in Aquarius, correct, is in a bad dignity. The moon in Capricorn is in a neutral dignity in principle, okay? We're not doing this with all the rules of temporary and essential in terms of doing the constructive dignity, because it will change depending on the specific chart. But for example, the sun in Aquarius can only reach a great enemy dignity or a neutral dignity, while the moon in Capricorn can only achieve a friend dignity or an enemy dignity. These are not the best dignities, okay? At the same time, Jupiter in Virgo or in Gemini can only achieve a dignity of great enemy or neutral, while Mercury in the signs of Jupiter can only achieve debilitation in Pisces, obviously, and it can only achieve enemy or friend dignity in Sagittarius. Okay? Now, Mars in Taurus or Scorpio can only reach a dignity of enemy or friend, and at the same time, Venus can only reach a dignity of enemy or friend in Scorpio and Aries. So you see here, even though exile or detriment, by the way, exile is how we, in Spanish-speaking countries, we allude to it, or detriment, even though it does not exist in Jyotisha, the dignity is 180 degrees away from the domicile is not good. Now, triplicity lords do not exist in Jyotisha because the idea of a day chart and night chart is just, it is present in Kalavala, but it's not really used. And obviously, terms are not used in Jyotish, although there are allusions to it. And I was reading Brihad Jataka, and there's a part where you kind of see terms, but they're not used. Because obviously in Jyotish you have Vargas, which I think is something really funny, because I think that when Hellenistic astrology came to India, they kind of saw this idea of the divisions of like the 12 parts and all that, and they said, oh, we can construct charts by using the ascendant, which is something that Hellenistics didn't use. But Vargas is a murky place that I'm not going to go into, because there's a lot of things there that are inconclusive to say. So you have to take that into consideration. Now, see here, I did not include phase or decans, because in Jyotish you have Drekanas, right? But you also have the D3 chart, and they're constructed in different ways. So you have to take this into consideration in terms of triplicities, which is interesting, okay? Now, let's move on to the next one, to the 9. Attention to the nodes. Oh my God. Let's talk about this, because unfortunately, a lot of the things that are done to the nodes are from modern astrology. All this idea that comes with the idea of future life, past life, it's modern astrology. You're never going to see a book of Jyotish that talks about north node is future lives, south node it's past lives. It does not exist, okay? So you have to take that into consideration. However, these modern precepts have filtered themselves into traditional Jyotish, making people think that this is traditional Jyotish, and it is not. The nodes are important in traditional Jyotish. They are almost always negative unless they are associated with Raja Yogas in quadrant houses or Trikona houses, okay? With no relationship to impressionable or Trishadaya lords, okay? Now, they are spoken a lot in Jyotish books. They're seen as malefics, and there's a lot of attention given to them to such a degree that they're considered part of the Navagraha scheme. They're considered part of the Vimshottari scheme. So the nodes have a lot of things to do there. Now, in antiquity, the nodes had particular assignments. For example, Rahu alluded to solar eclipse or lunar eclipse, while Ketu was more of comets and asteroids, okay? So there's a lot of attention given to the nodes in Jyotish astrology. Now, in non-Jyotish astrology, the nodes they're giving attention, but they're not giving that much attention. Usually north node expands, south node decreases, north node with benefic planets good, increases good, north node with malefic planets bad, increases the bad, south node with good planets bad, decreases the good, south node with malefics good because it decreases the bad. And you kind of have also allusions to the moon when they're in quadrants to them. So you take that into consideration, because it is very important. The nodes are not always seen as negative in non-Jyotish traditional astrology, more so than in Jyotish, because as I mentioned, they do look positively when in Raja Yoga arrangements. So take that into consideration. Now, the next one, retrograde Chestavala. This is very important. This is another form that comes into the Shatbala scheme. Retrogradation is very confusing, once again, because of modern astrology. In modern astrology, nothing is good, nothing is bad. Hence, everything is subjective and relative. However, there has to be something that has to take the bad. And in modern astrology, retrogradation is the trash can where everything bad falls into. This is why people think that retrogradation is horrible. But that is a modern conception which is not true. Now, from a non-Jyotish point of view, traditional astrology, retrogradation is bad, but it's not the worst thing, because it's the idea that our planet is going back in time. He's doing things that he already did. He's not proceeding, he's retroceding. So he's not going forward, he's going backward. Hence shows certain timidity, shame, or so on and so forth. But it was something that was taken into the accidental dignity, which was part of a bigger calculation. Okay? So in non-Jyotish traditional astrology is seen as bad, but not as bad as in modern astrology. Now, this is something that most Jyotishis and most Vedic astrologers from a Western context do not understand. In Jyotish, retrogradation is good because it has a strong Chestavala, which is the force of movement. And that means that when you have a retrograde planet, that planet is more confident in its movement. It has more reliability in terms of its capacities. So you have to take that into consideration, okay? So this brings a lot of confusion, because then you say, what is the correct diagnosis for retrogradation. Is it the worst thing like in modern astrology? Is it a minor worst thing in traditional non-Jyotish astrology? Or is it a good thing in traditional Jyotish astrology? Well, welcome to the world of astrology. There's not a correct answer to it. I would say that the best way would be to synthesize a way in which the traditional Jyotish idea of Chestabala comes into harmony with the non-Jyotish traditional idea of retrogradation and going backward. But forget about the apocalyptic definition of retrogradation that comes within the psychological modern astrology. That is just an aberration. It is just incorrect. Okay? So let's move on. Here we have another one, which is the overemphasis of yogas. Jyotish overemphasizes yogas combinations, which allude to the traditional Indian and Asian technique of memorization. Now, an oral tradition. Now, it is not that in non-Jyotish traditional astrology there are not mentions of yogas, because they are, but they are not mentioned as yogas. They're not mentioned as a terminology of yogas per se. They're mentioned more in the idea of certain specific cases. But in Jyotish, there's a lot of emphasis on memorization of certain patterns. Why? Some people might say that it's because of the absence of a traditional systematic approach to Jyotish, which is kind of true, but there's no such thing as a systematic approach to astrology, if you really think about it. That is a very modern technique. From a traditional perspective, you just had to learn, pray, and things would fall into place. Now there's an overemphasis on yogas, which is very noticeable in Jyotish. For example, the most famous book on that is the B.B. Raman little book, where you have over, I think, 300 or 3,000 combinations. I don't remember how much they were, but 300 combinations. I'm sorry. So that's a little book that serves a lot. But remember, learning yogas is good, but it's not the best, because you have to know a lot of other things in order to have a holistic approach to the chart and look for confluence. Remember, confluence, 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 confluence. You will reach a closer approach to the truth that way. Okay. And finally, we have the overemphasis on remedies, mantras, and tapas. In non-Jyotish traditional astrology, there was an overemphasis on destiny. This is why I think Christianity became very popular, because it gave a lot of Mediterraneans the idea of being able to express freedom within their fate. From the Stoic perspective, from the Hermetic perspective, from the Neoplatonic perspective, destiny was very strong, and it is something that you have to accept. So there was not a lot of free will involved. However, in Jyotish, there is free will. Okay, and it is free will through mantras and tapas. And remember, and this is very important, jewels are not remedies. They're not as stipulated in the classics. Talismans can be remedies, but they come from Muslim astrology. Talisman can exist maybe in Jyotish. Maybe they are kept secret in certain parampras. But just because you buy a ruby, your sun will not improve. Just because you have a pearl, your moon will not improve. Just because you have a red coral, your Mars will not improve. That is not true. If you want remedies, you got to pray. You got to do mantras, and you got to do tapas, which are offerings. If you go to Brihat Parashara Hora Shastra, when Parashara talks about maladies, or when he talks about the periods in Vimshottari, he talks about how to fix things. Giving away a goat, giving away a cow, giving away clothes, giving away food, doing certain mantras, and so on and so forth. So you see here that in Jyotish, there's a more emphasis on free will than in, more Hellenistic traditions, right? And this is one of the reasons I think Christianity, became more popular than astrology. So basically, guys, these are 12 big differences. I like to mention one that I didn't copy down because I wanted to have 12 and not 13. And those are the aspects, the planetary aspects and the Rashi aspects. In Jyotish, there are 3 types of aspects, which are Rashi aspects, which are sign aspects, which do not exist in my knowledge in traditional non-Jyotish astrology. Graha aspects, which have a different form than normal Graha aspects in non-Jyotish traditional astrology, and Barsafala aspects that are more or less what the traditional aspects are in non-Jyotish traditional astrology. So it is incorrect to say that in Jyotish, you do not use the same aspects as in Hellenistic or Muslim astrology, because you do use them in Barsafara. And you can use them in normal D1 charts, as Bibi Rahman said in one of his books. And I believe that K.N. Rao might have said that too. But, you know, the biggest difference is the idea of the opposition, and how the opposition in Hellenistic astrology is seen as very bad, or at least adversarial, and how in Jyotish is not seen as such, and how quadrants and angular houses, in terms of Kendra and the idea of angular houses, are seen bad. No, well, not Kendra angular, I'm sorry. The idea of squares, how they're seen bad in non-Jyotish traditional astrology because it's a bad aspect, and how they're seen many times as good within Jyotish, is something that has to be emphasized, which can bring a lot of confusion also for people who come from traditional non-Jyotish astrology. But the idea is that there are ways to bridge them together. And more, for example, I'm doing more aspects in terms of Hellenistic aspects, because I think it's more reasonable, and, you know, it's more logical. So there you have it, guys. 12 big differences. Let's just review them. Sidereal, zodiac, tropical zodiac, fourth and parent dichotomy, relationship between Sun and Saturn, the luminaries and their qualities, sect and Kalavala, dashes and perfections, the 11th house, the absence of certain dignities, attention to the nose, retrogradation and Chestavala, overemphasis on yogas, overemphasis on remedies and mantras, and the honorary mention of aspects that do not necessarily change, but there are certain particularities that can be bridged. So guys, I hope you like this video. If you have any questions, please feel free to write them down. Go to my channel, and, you know, if you haven't subscribed to Asheville Vedic Astrology, do it. It's one of the best resources of Vedic astrology on the internet, on YouTube, and it is a great place where you can learn a lot. So as always, I wish you all strength, serenity, and wisdom. God bless, and see you in the next one.